Welcoming people in, and then hello, everyone. You know, we always see, I never want to start right away because I always see the numbers sort of like inch up, but if we don't start talking, then I start to get private messages from everyone saying that they can't hear us.
I'm just having jealousy. I feel like I need books behind me, or maybe I should paint books on the wall behind me. It's not as good of a view I have here.
Or you should just take out a book and start reading.
It looks a little bit like a mugshot there.
Do you want, if I get out of the way, you could take a screenshot of mine. And
there we go. I'll just put it behind me.
That was when COVID first started and everyone shifted to Zoom. One of our friends did that in more of Felicia's class. Like, she stepped away, and so they took a screenshot of her box and then made it their kid's background. So like, just to mess with people, why not? Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's so good to be with all of you, and really glad that you're joining us as we continue wrestling with some of the major issues that are facing our world today. And it feels like those issues are only getting bigger and bigger and more complex and heavier, and really weighing on our hearts. So we were actually just doing like a quick chat beforehand, and so we're pulling back the curtain a little bit, and to let you know that what we had planned to talk about today was to really get into some of the ideas of chosenness. After we kind of wrestled with God and with Torah and with Israel and with all of these different pieces, we thought maybe we would shift to really thinking about how we understand this idea of chosenness in the Jewish community. And then we also started thinking about, you know, everything that was happening in the world, and I think really started to feel like actually maybe these things are deeply connected in terms of, as we look out into the world, how do we understand this through the lens of being Jews, and how do we understand it in terms of what does it mean of what we're called upon to do as Jews, or as citizens of the world? Do we think about this differently? So we're pivoting live. We're just going to see where this takes us, but I'm going to still pass it over to you, Carney, to kind of start us off. And you all are with us on this ride because none of us know where we're going yet, but we'll all have fun getting there.
Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for that great introduction. Just to remind us, of course, that we are Hartman Fellows, all of us, and deeply dedicated to the work of the Hartman Institute as well, and grateful to the Hartman Institute for all of the training we receive and the ongoing inspiration that we receive. Ki mitzion teitze Torah, out of both Jerusalem and New York. The Hartman Institute continues to be a place of inspiration for all of us, and I appreciate the good work that they continue to do so that we can continue the work that we're doing with additional grist for our creative and spiritual mills. Today, we were going to talk about the notion of chosenness, and as you heard, we're going to pivot a little bit because in some ways, world events that are swirling about, I think, necessitate a conversation that is really from our hearts. I can feel a little bit of heaviness as we kind of got on to the conversation. I could see in the faces the glowing Shana Punim, right? The beautiful faces of my colleagues, that there are issues that are really weighing heavy, and I think we all feel that way. And we're going to touch on some of those during the course of this conversation. But I did want to keep us back on the ranch a little bit and begin by asking Autumn to do us a favor, if possible, Autumn, to put up the brachot that are recited before and after the reading of the Torah traditionally. And I hope that everybody can join with me wherever you are at home. Maybe we could actually sing it together. You can remember what it was like at your bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, or when you had your kids smachot or grandkids smachot, whatever. So you remember the brachot, or at least the melodies, right? Baruch hu et Adonai Amvorach, Baruch Adonai Amvorach leolam vaed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, ve'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. And there we have, in transliteration as well as the translation, Blessed Adonai, who is blessed now and forever. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who has chosen us from among the peoples, mikol ha'amim, right? And given us the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, powerful are you, blessed are you, Adonai, who gives the Torah, or is in the process, right, of giving the Torah, because noten haTorah, right, is happening in the here and now as well. And as we look at this classic bracha, here I think comes to the fore I think, the beginning of the conversation about what chosenness might really mean. Asher bachar banu. God chose us, mikol ha'amim, from amongst all the nations of the world, to do what? To give us the Torah. By the way, part A of this and part B are connected to one another, right? The bachar banu, the selecting us, the electing of us, the choosing of us, is manifest in the giving us of this wonderful gift called Torah. And that bracha, for many of us, resonates because we know it from childhood. We know it throughout our lifetimes. We recite it on a regular basis. And yet, over the course of time, as we begin to unpack and think, not only sort of chant, recite, sort of intone, we begin to think about, what does that mean? What does it mean to announce out loud in synagogue, right? For those who read Torah several times during the course of the week, right? On Monday, Thursday, Shabbos, Asher bachar banu, chose us, right? And gave us this Torah. Does that mean it's the exclusive purview of Jews? Is it only ours? And if it is ours, what does it mean by way of obligations and responsibilities for us as we move forward? And so I wanted just to throw into this mix another version of the brachot, if Autumn has them available for us as well. These are the brachot that come from the Reconstructionist Siddur. And so this is the Reconstructionist Siddur. If you could take a look at the bottom section, at the bottom 396, where it says commentary. You see that at the bottom, commentary? Yeah, down here. The 1945 Reconstructionist prayer book eliminated all reference to Jewish chosenness for both ideological, whoops, I lost it, and moral reasons. Chosenness posits a God who chooses, and it supports claims of national superiority. Thus, that prayer book's Torah's blessings replace Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, who has chosen us from all the peoples, with Asher Kirvanu La'avodato, which means the God, or the power that makes for salvation, since it's a Reconstructionist Siddur, right? Who has drawn us to your service, meaning it's a move away from election that has to do with who we are biologically, who we are in terms of who our parents are, who we are in terms of our nationality, whatever way in which you want to talk about this. And this is the God who draws us close to God's service. And this prayer book follows the 1945 version, but provides on the next side of the page, right, alternatives in commentary. And if we could make it just a little smaller, maybe people can see the alternatives that are on this page. Not, it's on the second side, it's 397, a little bit higher up, right? We got it, there we go, okay? So here you can take a look where it says 1, 2, and 3, right? So in section 1, you have the beginning of the bracha, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Then you have a second version, right? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu chei haolamim, or chai haolamim. Blessed is the one who is the eternal one, God of all life, or life of all worlds. And then it says, let us bless the source of life, or the one who chose to bring us closer, right? Or one who chose us, or the one who brought us closer to God's service. And then Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. There are 3 options here in this Reconstructionist prayer book, which I think in some ways lay out some options for us, particularly those of us who struggle with the notion of what does it mean to be elected or to be chosen. And I think that's the issue that we want to get to, and want to do it simultaneously with thinking about contemporary realities that many of us are engaged with at this moment in time, be those global realities far from home, or some events that are transpiring much closer to home for many of us and struggling with it. So what I'd like to try to do is give us an opportunity to reflect on these brachot first. Each of us, we're kind of riffing, folks, and we're kind of a little less formalized than we have been in the past by going to some texts, but want to reflect on the notion of chosenness, election. Which of these brachot and which manifestation makes sense to you? What do you make of the notion of chosenness or election? And what responsibilities, obligations do you feel based on this bracha? And what are the edges? Are you challenged by the words of this bracha in a way that make you feel not only motivated, but maybe uncomfortable with some of the ways in which we're conducting business and living our lives at this particular moment in time? So with that frame, I appreciate the opportunity to try to frame it a little bit. And now we'll go to some of the other colleagues who want to share some thoughts and feelings. Bevakasha.
Jim, do you want to take it? I know you were having a lot of feelings about some of this before.
Yeah, I'm happy to offer some preliminary thoughts. I have a lot of feelings about this, and the fact that I'm having trouble articulating them reflects the great and deep ambivalence. I have to say, as a Reform Jew, member of the ideologically Reform movement that in its origins, also a century before the Reconstructionist movement published its revised version of these brachot, in the Pittsburgh Platform in 1885, the Reform movement took a firm stand on this issue of chosenness by rejecting it in favor of an unqualified sense of universalism, a commitment as Jews to be engaged fully with the world and all people. And, in many matters, I do not align myself personally with the Pittsburgh Platform, the 1885 Reform movement, but on this issue, I have always and remain deeply committed to these ideas. And so I embrace what you just read to us, Rabbi Rose Carney, the concept of trying to grapple with how to reframe or actually reject a concept of chosenness. I've always been amused, and thinking back to my earliest memories of this struggle with chosenness, I never got it, to be perfectly frank. I just never got it. I never felt the need to reframe it as choosing as opposed to chosen. I never understood what it meant, and it never meant anything to me personally. I don't want to devalue the meaning of being Jewish. I find deep and profound and abiding meaning in being Jewish, but I neither need nor can accept any premise that suggests any kind of superiority or unique mission for me as a Jew, other than just to live true to the values of my faith and to share them with others, and to hope that I can expand my faith and my commitments and my values to others to share them, and that in a sense that they compel me to be engaged with others. So I've always rejected the concept that we should care about ourselves first, and to the exclusion of caring about others. And there are so many contemporary issues that illustrate this, both locally and in our state and in our nation, and then in the world at large, that can illustrate this. But I laughingly reject all such efforts to reframe or reorganize or rethink or explain away the negative impact of chosenness. I just reject it. I simply reject it. I feel no need to dwell there. So I'll leave it there for now. I'm sure I'll have a lot more to say if you guys ever let me say anything else after that.
So, no, absolutely, and I appreciate the position. Could I ask you a question, Rabbi? What is the practice at Sheremuth in terms of people coming to the Torah for aliyot? Is your strong feeling impacted in any way, shape, or form? What happens liturgically?
Well, actually, the truthful answer is, because we also allow our members, as members of a Reform community, to choose their own interpretation of ritual. We offer, and I would say the vast majority of times, our bima, people recite the traditional blessings, often not even knowing what they're reciting, frankly, reciting a Hebrew formula that has power and meaning in and of itself without reading its English translation. We do offer, particularly to non-Jews who say, well, this blessing, it's ironic that the non-Jewish members of our community often are the only ones who read the translation and pay attention to the translation of what they're being asked to do if they wish. And we do offer an alternative version of this, a different alternative version that comes from the Reform prayer book, Mishkan Tefillah, that offers a more inclusive way to frame Torah other than as uniquely being given to the Jewish people. But I would say 95% of our regular attendees ascend the bima and recite the bracha just like you did so beautifully a moment ago, because there's power in words, but there's also power in tradition. And by the way, if we read carefully every word we chant as Jews and what they mean, we often would go, really? Did I just say that out loud? Now, the Reform movement early on changed a lot of that liturgical text. We changed the words of the Aleinu to be much more inclusive rather than very particularistic. We changed the brachot in the Torah blessings, but over time, the movement has gravitated back towards a more inclusive in the other direction, saying, well, there's something to be said for words, even if we don't really believe them. Maybe Daniel, you can elaborate on that, because I know you.
I just want to make sure I understand, because I'm not sure I understand the minhag, right? If you don't mind, just a custom. So how you go about doing, so a person comes to the bima at Sheremet, there is an opportunity for a person to have one of a series of options before the Torah is read. Is that right?
That
both
conversation,
for Jews and non-Jews.
Yeah, that is offered particularly. Most of we read Torah on Shabbat morning and when there's a bar bat mitzvah family, so they're generally assigning the aliyot. So there's a conversation with them if they'd like to read the brachot or chant the brachot, or if they have, particularly if they have non-Jewish members, there is an alternative that they can choose from if they wish.
Gotcha. Rabbi Dana, did you want to take up Rabbi Bennett's invitation to?
Sure. Yeah, I'm thinking about the way that movement plays into this too. And I know that's a discussion we've talked about having, right? This is one of those moments when we've got an Orthodox rabbi and a couple Reform rabbis and a conservative rabbi. Echoing what Jim said, these are not close to the words that would bother me the most in the Siddur if I was thinking of them literally. And so, one of the ways that I have really changed in my thinking in the last 3, 4, 5 years is I've read a lot of social science research, looking at how people act and what people say they believe. Notice I said what they say they believe, not what they actually believe. And what an overwhelming amount of this research points to is that actually very, very few of us are ideologues. Even those of us who imagine that we belong to an ideology, we're just not, that we really, these specific meanings aren't what's happening. I think what's happening when we're called up to the Torah is tribal affiliation, right? And that, of course, is what's happening all over, right? We, in our politics, it's not like we're actually having debates over ideas. We're having debates over tribal expressions and tribal power. Rory and I certainly saw that yesterday in Jeff City. If we're a little fuzzy, we got back at, 12:30 or something. But
Rabbi Daniel, say more, because I'm not sure everybody on this call knows exactly what it is that you were doing.
Oh, yeah. Rory and I were in Jeff City the 5th time in 5 weeks now, testifying with a whole bunch of other folks against some pretty awful, bigoted and bullying bills targeted at trans kids in this state. But right, it's clear, you go into one of those hearings, for instance, right? And people are testifying on both sides of these issues, but it's not like there's really a discussion of ideas that's happening. You're not convincing people. You're trying to sway people based on their tribal loyalties. And I think actually that's what's happening when we get called up to the Torah too, right? We are coming up there and we may say, Asher bachar banu mikol amim, that God chose us from amongst all the peoples. But I think actually what's happening in that moment is an expression of where we stand and who we stand with. And to me, that's what chosenness really is. Chosenness in the end is an expression of tribe. And whether I want to be or not want to be, right? Like to me, my Jewishness feels so essential to who I am, even as I understand identity is malleable and so on and so forth. Yeah, I feel like I'm rambling here, but.
So can I, if I could pick up the mantle on that, because I don't know if I have a specific thought about the brachot. I love looking at alternative language, not because it's language that I personally often end up using, but because there's something so like beautiful and somewhat radical for me of like thinking that there's other language that can be used, you know, as opposed to the traditional. But I think because it actually gives us such a clearer understanding of what we say when we realize that this is an intentional choice to say this as opposed to any of the other things. So I don't know if I'm going to have a specific answer to the question in terms of brachot, but I want to talk more generally about sort of chosenness, because I think what I wrestle with about chosenness is the ways that for me growing up, I think that language of chosenness was often deeply connected and intertwined with language of persecution. Right? There was this idea of like the Jews were chosen, and what does it mean that the Jews were chosen? Or like somehow the proof of chosenness was the ways in which like Jews have existed as victims throughout history, right? Which there's like a sort of ironic element, but I think that there was like a really intentional claiming of this, right? Like we were destined to suffer because that's how God will then give us the greatest reward, right? Or whatever it is. And I think, you know, I wrestle with that like theologically. I think from a sociological, historical context, there's something about that makes sense to me, right? Like when you live as a people who are constantly a minority and persecuted, right? Like this is the sort of like, we're going to stick it to them, right? Like they think that they're more powerful, but actually we're really more powerful. And this is all like a giant joke, right? Like they think that they're winning, but like us being that weak little minority, like they don't know that actually we have God on our side. And like, you know, God's going to kind of come and like take this back.
That's the fantasy of the Aleinu. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Like that's exactly. And so like I think that I kind of get that, right? Like I get that desire and I get what it is like to feel that and to then want to like lay claim to this superior, stronger stature. And then I get to the what now? Because that I think has been like a trope of a lot of our conversations is like, what do we do with it now that the American Jewish community is one of the most powerful minority communities? Again, never dismissing that we experience anti-Semitism, like we've had conversations about that, right? But like, I don't think that we can at all diminish power that we hold. What it is for the Jews to have Israel and the power that exists in the state of Israel and the global power that Jews then experience like through Israel, through positions that we have in America. You know, there are Jewish communities across the world that are in much more precarious situations, right? But like we have these two really significant Jewish communities. And so then suddenly like we have this language of chosenness and like, what do we do with it, right? Like that's the part that I really grapple with. And to me, it's why I think that one of the questions we're really wrestling with as a Jewish community today is like the so what, right? So like if the Jewish community, like if we are, so that's where like I want to say like it's not just like the okay, chosen, therefore what, or what do we do with it? Like I think there is a moral question in it, but I want to even push, it's not even just like morally I want to say so what. I want to say like we have spent centuries, millennia developing this language to claim power when we've never had power. And now that we have power, do we use this language of chosenness to say, therefore, we're only going to care about Jews? We're only going to advocate on causes where Jews care about, right? I mean, I really struggle with this question of like how we're all talking about what's happening in Ukraine and the ways in which, on the one hand, I do feel this intense sense of pride of seeing the ways that the Jewish community is rallying for the Jewish community, of knowing that there is like, there is a tribe, right? Knowing that like I'm part of a tribe, and if God forbid like I was ever in danger, like there's like a people that are sort of my people who, you know, who could be there for me even without knowing me. There's something really beautiful in that. But there's also like this humanitarian crisis that's happening for millions of people, and like if we stop at the Jews, then who are we? And so that's the part of chosenness that I'm caught up in.
Rory, can I want to just push even a little further, because I think we have spent centuries, millennia now as a people trying to defend or reinterpret a narrative that I believe, look, this is just me. I know this is just me. Maybe there's others who share this with me, that we need to let go of. We actually need to stop trying to justify and explain this narrative of chosenness. And we need to say, you know what? We don't need that. And I feel the same way about this, maybe in reaction to this growth in our lifetimes of nationalism and tribalism. it's one thing to reinterpret and to say, well, it says that God chose us, but that's not really what it meant. It meant this, or whatever. It means we're the choosing people, or what if we acknowledge that narrative was true then for those people because they needed it, but it simply isn't true anymore. We are not chosen. And, that's hard because we've been called the chosen people by others for 2,000 years also. I mean, we are, for the evangelical Christian community in particular, and for Christianity at large, the chosen people. And we are resented for being the chosen people. And we seek to reinterpret it. All these theological, gymnastics that the thinkers that Carney has brought for us to take a look at if we have time, I hope we will, have tried to explain them or reinterpret them or offer alternative readings of them. I'd like to suggest that maybe we just need to let go of them. And you bring up Ukraine, that's a perfect example. Lots of people are saying, well, the Jews have to go into Ukraine and take care of the Jews. And Israel's behavior in this crisis is abominable. It's abominable that Israel is trying to walk the fence and not anger Russia. But Israel should throw its borders wide open to the refugees, regardless of their Jewish status, regardless of whether they're related to somebody who moved to Israel or not, regardless of anything. If all the other values of our tradition mean anything, the value of welcoming the stranger and rescuing the refugee, those values ought to be much more dominant than some sense of obligation to ourselves because of chosenness. I'm just curious to know whether we actually could just let go of this chosenness completely instead of having to justify it or explain it. Can we just, go ahead, Daniel, sorry.
I really have a question for you on this, because I'm struck that, first of all, I resonate with everything you have said, all of the values, all of the words. And I wonder if there is any culture on this planet that doesn't have chosenness as a part of its narrative. I mean, we have this unique language around it, right? People don't use exactly that language, but right. So American exceptionalism, or nationalism is an inherently chosen.
Or white supremacy, right?
White supremacy or Christian election to heaven, or right. Like I genuinely think you can go on and on and on. And it strikes me that this is a human condition, right? And don't we always in a war look for the people who look most like us first?
Well, I think your implied question is exactly what I'm trying to say. In other words, I think that's the problem. I think we as a people gravitate to this least common denominator of, well, I'm going to create these false narratives, be they race or gender or nationality or ethnic identity. All this is identity politics, is all it is.
But I don't think you can have humans without these things, right?
So gents, just for a second, right? Number one, I want to ask the question, and again, there are many parts of what you're both saying that I resonate with, and there are also aspects that I'm concerned about. When I say to my family, our family is special, it doesn't mean my family's better. It means my family is special. And I think in some way, this organizational principle called "we are special for the following reasons," right, is something that I still very much want to hold on to, right? Remember that bracha says, "Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim," right? Chose us from the nations of the world to do what? V'natan lanu et Torato. They go together, part A, and gave us the Torah, which is supposed to be the manual for how we live our lives appropriately. So I'm not so quick to give up on this, even though I understand the dangers of it all when pushed to a certain place. On the other hand, isn't it a wonderful way in which to start with a self-identity that is, there are concentric circles of identity. And on some level, I have to feel myself to be good in some way, to be charged with a mission in some way, to have an agenda in some way, to belong to something that allows me to then walk in the world with a sense of who I am. And so those concentric circles, I think, can get created by this bracha or by this orientation. I have a job that I've been given in the world. The Lord, right, called upon me, or called upon our people to do this. It doesn't absolve me of responsibility and obligation to do more. It's a starting place. And if you start in that place, then you see that we move towards this. And by the way, somebody asked the question about the Aleinu. And the Aleinu is an interesting tefillah because we know part A because we sing it. But what about the second part of the Aleinu? Al ken nekaveh lecha, right? That next paragraph, which doesn't appear in Al Sidurim, it doesn't appear in Al Sidurim in exactly the same fashions, right? And there are some terrible things that appear in that Al ken, right? That are really
Anti-Christian polemic built right in. Yeah.
Absolutely. But the very end, V'ne'emar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz, the notion that all of humanity have a heavenly parent, have the notion, right? It's on that day, God will be one, right? God's name will be one. The notion that there is the possibility of an ultimate time when we will all recognize what we'll call godliness or God or goodness or equality, all the values that we believe in. And so the question is, I try to figure out, for me at least, right? What kind of religious tradition could have enough like trappings that would make me feel connected to my own identity as a member of the House of Israel, and not some kind of integralist spiritualist that's out there. Like, there's got to be something then more than just the rituals for me create that identity. And I don't want to lose the language. I'd rather play the game, which I know, Rabbi Bennett, it sounds like you would disagree with me. I'd rather play the game of reinterpreting the liturgy to suit the need of today, to make it possible that, okay, those folks had myopias. I have my myopias today. My children will see that my myopias, they already see them. And they'll say, now I'm going to make it a little bit better. I'm going to fatach and fabesser it so that it's ready for the next era, but they won't lose maybe the core essential notions. And maybe that's why I'm a conservative rabbi, I'm a conservative Jew, because I feel like I can dance in both of these places simultaneously and still see a utility to some kind of particularism that allows for me to say, yeah, I start here, I don't end here, right? The ultimate goal is not for me just to change myself or to change just my little Jewish world. It is to change the entire world, but utilizing the tools that were granted to us, including the great Torah, which is the great inheritance and great gift to us.
So I'm with you, I think, more, Carney. Like I'm
What a surprise.
I know, right? I'm like trying to not be a stereotype. No, but I mean, I think, it's reminding me, I don't remember if I've quoted it here before, because I quote it not infrequently, but I had a professor in college who, she used to love to say that there's nothing wrong with going outside and feeling like the sun is shining directly on you. The only problem is if you think it's not shining on anyone else. And I love that. Like, I love, right? Because like, they're like, some days, like, you need the sun to shine on you and you need to feel like that connection. And I think especially like with the pandemic, I mean, maybe even before that, but it's so easy. I think we live in a culture where we feel so unmoored, right? Like we sort of reject all of these, I mean, and I hear like the dangers of identity politics, but I think we so like vehemently want to reject them when, like, that's sort of also how I know, like, I can love all people, but there's only, like, you sort of have to know like who to first call to ask for coffee, right? Like, you don't just go up to random strangers. And I think about, just the ways in which, you can move to a new place and finding a synagogue just suddenly immediately like can give you a community. But by the way, I mean, Daniel, like, you and I going to Jeff City for 5 times in a row, like, there's a community that we're a part of there, right? Like, there's the same people who are, bringing the snacks, and like, we've got our own inside jokes, right? Like, there's a right? And so like, you find community in a lot of different ways. And I would also say, by the way, like, that community in Jeff City, right? Like, it's a righteous one, because I mean, I would say we think, but like, I want to say we know, like, we're on the right side of history on all of those bills, and the other, we don't think the other people are, like, I think ultimately we'll be proven right in that. I mean, I think we already are.
But that's chosenness too, right? Like, that's
what I'm saying, right? Like, it is, right? It is a chosenness, and there's something that like I'm deeply connected to within that, and there's something that like I love about sort of showing up and someone else is wearing the t-shirt and you sort of like know who your people are, and you're fighting for something that's good and noble. And so like, I'm not willing to give up, because there's something, I don't know, there's something about, and Jim, I don't think that, like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as you were speaking, I don't think you were going like so far afield, but as you were speaking, I kind of felt like untethered, right? Like there was something about sort of like eliminating some of these ideas that made me feel really scared, because I need a place. Like I need a place in this world.
I think exactly that's where you were going. I don't gonna speak for you, but I think that's where you were going, Rabbi.
I understand that, Rory. And yes, look, I want to say, Carney and Rory both, I understand that we feel more comfortable and gravitate towards people with whom we have some shared identity. But when you talk about the aspiration of the Aleinu, for example, Carney, the goal of the Aleinu actually is a world in which there is no individualized, tribal, or ideologically separated identities. So what I was trying to say to push the envelope here is, do we really mean that? Do we really want, I'll talk about race, the construct of race. Are we really willing to do what it is necessary? It's easy to gravitate towards people that are like us. And Rory, to your point, yeah, of course you and Daniel feel this sense of group, comfort, but real progress towards that goal of the Aleinu, that the day shall come when all are united under, in a common belief in the one God, that comes from leaving our comfort zones and developing relationships beyond our naturally occurring boundaries. So yes, I think I want it both. I want us to be able to be comfortable and to live in this world, but I'm, we're here talking ideologically and theoretically. I am personally drawn deeply towards pushing the boundaries of these theological limits of our narratives and our prayer book and our Siddur, the words we say, and to not let ourselves become complacent, because if we really mean what we say we believe we are working towards, if, in this vision of the Jews were chosen to be a light unto the nation and to teach everybody else about blah, 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 whatever our values are, then we have to actually be willing at least to talk about what it would look like if we destroyed those boundaries and crossed those limits. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about having a synagogue community that actually looks like what we say we want to look like, what we are aiming to look like. And we all are not doing that. And I think that's the challenge with Israel today, that Israel says one thing ideologically and is doing something different. And I think it's a problem in our nation. And I actually think it's the problem in our own local, very, very hyper localized lives as well. We say one thing, but then we live in our neighborhoods, our very tribal and, very divided, separate communities. And that's not what we say we want, but we keep doing it. We keep replicating.
So I'm not disagreeing with you on that for sure. Okay, 100% I'm with you. I just want to go back to this notion of, unity without uniformity. When I say the words, at the very end of the Aleinu, I don't think that we're all going to be practicing in the same way. What I want to be able to do is sort of a sacred envy, to look at the way in which you are practicing, Rabbi Bennett, and you, Rabbi Bogart, and you, Maharat Rory, are practicing, and to have a kind of sacred envy and to say, isn't it powerful and wonderful the way in which that person lives out their sense of what it means to be called upon by God, to be chosen to do whatever it is that we're chosen to do. I don't have to do it the same way. So we can be brothers and sisters, and we can be people of faith together in community, and we could be connected to one another in a wide variety of ways and actually live our lives very differently, right? Tuesday night, we might have meatloaf, and that, in other place, people, you don't have meatloaf on Tuesday night, but Tuesday night's our minhag. And it doesn't mean that it's a bad minhag, right? I hate to make it so banal, right? But I'm going to a place because I want to make the point that I think it really is not about us all doing this in the same fashion. It's about doing it in different fashions. It's one of the things that I find so fascinating with all the negativity that exists, right? To be able to talk to people of faith, but of different faiths. And even within faith communities, the nuances that are different. And that for me, it's very exciting. It's one of the great blessings that we have living as we do in a post-enlightenment, right, post-emancipation world in which we find ourselves into this postmodern reality. It feels so exciting to me that down the street from me can be worship that is so powerful and meaningful for that group of people, that the work that people are doing in politics, right, based on their religious convictions, that the work that people are doing in terms of hunger and homelessness, right? I have all the, if I could go around this Zoom and talk about the sacred envy that I have for the work that Sharamith is doing, bringing with the Afghanis, the work that the two of you were doing in Jeff City. It's amazing to me, and so many others. And so I just want to make sure that when we use this Bachar Banu, yeah, it may have meant something at a moment in time. It may have functioned in a certain way at a certain moment in time. But because it did that, we don't have to get stuck there, at least for me. And I can still use the language and find it meaningful and inspirational and aspirational and motivational to the point of pushing me to be far better than I am today. And I think we all would agree with that. The question is, where does this liturgical, and maybe this is a deeper conversation about what is prayer really intended to do? Right? What do we hope to accomplish in this prayer? Who are we praying to? Right? And what does this work do for us? And lehitpalel is a reflexive verb, right? It goes out to go up, to go in. I mean, that's sort of the imagery that I like to think about. But does that really part of what we're doing here? And is it really? And by the way, I'm the first one to talk about the need on some level to reimagine what tefillah should really be all about, particularly, I think, in our contemporary reality. So I'm saying a lot here, but I just want to go back to where I was, which is I don't think that unity and uniformity are the same thing. And I love the diversity that I'm seeing in the Jewish community. And for all the negativity, I also love the fact that so many different kinds of folks can express themselves as feeling connected to that Malchut Shaddai. Somebody put it in here, right, to the kingdom of God.
I'm really struck that on this, I feel myself gravitating a little more towards the Rory Carney poll than the Jim poll, which is kind of funny for Reform traditionalists, etc. I'm really struck by the way that it operates in practice at CRC, though, which is, right, you don't have to be Jewish to belong to CRC. You don't have to be Jewish to participate in any part of CRC. Anyone who feels like they are a part of this community is welcome. And so you can come up to the Torah. Absolutely, people come all the time up to the Torah for an aliyah who are not halachically Jewish in any way. And they stand up there and they recite Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, right? That chose us from amongst all of the peoples. And I guess I think in that sense, I live in a world where I act like Jim and say words like Carney. And I don't know, that feels comfortable to me. It doesn't, I don't mind that it requires a reimagination for everyone, for the rabbi, for the participants, for the et cetera, of what that ritual is.
But the danger is, as teachers of Torah, the problem is if we don't teach that nuance, which you just articulated so beautifully, we will get people stuck in reading the translation of exactly Asher Bachar Banu in a very limited kind of way. I wish when we said the bracha, and you said Asher Bachar Banu, and here's what I mean by Asher Bachar Banu, right? And you could give like a 5-minute discourse on what you really mean when you say those words, particularly in light of the section of the Torah that's about to be read, because here's what it means to me. But we don't have that opportunity to do that. And so I understand where Rabbi Bennett's coming from. The danger of saying it, the danger really does exist. Religion is a dangerous phenomenon. It's also the potentially most powerful phenomenon that we have within life in our world today.
Yeah, and from this lonely corner of the Zoom screen, I'll simply say
you're on my far left.
Yeah, I'm on the far right on my screen, but in any case, there is a difference between what we do. I think about this all the time. At Pesach, when we're sitting around the Seder table, chanting all sorts of words and saying all sorts of things, there's a difference between the things we do out of religious habit or ritual practice or behaviors and what we aspire to. And I approach this conversation aspirationally. And, I think about the fact that I'm always curious to know how other people hear the things we say or do. When we have visitors who are not members of our community, who are not Jewish, who come and read our prayer book, because often they read it carefully more carefully than we do. And I'm always curious to know when they read something and go, oh, really? Those Jews believe that? And I think to myself, actually, most of the people sitting in the pews don't believe those words. So there's a difference between the things we do out of habit or out of repetition or blindness and our aspirational identities. And, Carney, earlier when you were talking about saying to your family, we're special, of course, we all teach our children that they're special, but I think we have to be very careful. Does that mean they're more special than others? Or is everybody special? And is this like a summer camp where everybody wins every award, or a sports team where everybody gets a trophy? Or are there universal values that actually, regardless of which tribe you belong to, you are better if you live by those values because you're truer to the aspirational values? And my point is that Jewish tribal identification is not entitle you to a given superiority or a given level of chosenness just because you happen to be Jewish.
Could you say both, Rabbi Bennett? Could we say that it's both?
Yeah,
that,
exactly.
That on the
it's
one
both.
hand, we can say that we bring something special to the world. It's interesting. I think about this all the time. Like, what is it that I'm here to do? Right? What is it that we're here to do? I think if we spent more time in our tefillah talking about what is this experience supposed to enable us as a community to do, but also us as individuals to do, wouldn't it be wonderful at the end of tefillah to say, in our shul, we're down to a whole 2.5 hours, okay? So after 2.5 hours, at the end of the davening, and here is the last statement I want to make. It's not, God is with me and I have no fear at the end of Adon Olam, which is most shuls end with Adon Olam, right? But what about, this is what I commit to leave this space doing in light of this worship experience today. And there are lots of ways that certain traditional prayer books, right, Rory, like we have Ani Maamin, right, the statements of belief at the end, or V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love thy neighbors, whatever it is that I do at the end of the tefillah to end the tefillah, that it moves from this theoretical intoning of words that have been traditional to say, and now I'm going to go and do the following. And the yeshiva that I went to growing up, the last act of our tefillah was everybody had to give tzedakah. Right? You cannot leave the Beit Midrash without putting a penny in the pushki. So
even on Shabbos?
No, you just made a donation and a pledge.
Okay.
I made a pledge, right? And somebody remembered it. But the notion of you don't leave without, right, making a commitment. And I wondered if we ended tefillah in that way, right, in our communities. I've seen this in other faith communities. Today I leave this worship with this dedication, with this commitment, with this aspiration, with this hope.
Carney, that is a beautiful, beautiful goal. I mean, we actually do that indirectly at Sharameth. We end every service inviting people to give tzedakah, by the way, even on Shabbat. We have a cause that we're collecting for. We pass the plate essentially. But I love what you just described because it says, I'm not here just for myself. I'm not here to renew my commitment to my own exceptionalism as a member of this tribe, but I'm here because I have values that I'm willing to commit to. And so that person could not possibly leave the shul, for example, saying, okay, now I'm going to go and rescue some Jewish refugees from Ukraine because I'm a Jew and that's all I need to do. That person, for example, would say, wow, human beings and democracy are under attack in Ukraine. We need to do everything we can to protect them, to protect them all. And by the way, to stop this insanity and to unite as a world against a nation that is threatening to completely destroy a democratic nation right before our very eyes.
And maybe lead to a worldwide war. I mean, I'm with you 100%. The question is, are there interim steps along the way? In other words, can I say, and maybe not, maybe for me, for you, they're not, and for me, they are. Maybe I can say, okay, I'm going to walk away today, and I know I'm going to start this work of Tikkun HaOlam, the repair, by helping save the Jewish community, right? Or I'm going to donate to this organization within the Ukrainian Jewish reality, knowing that my ultimate goal is not just to save my own people, right? But my ultimate goal is to be more engaged and more involved. And I think incremental steps. We've been asked to really focus on this notion of Ukraine. If somebody wants to maybe say something about that, sort of how all of this work of the election of the people of Israel might relate to the Ukraine. If anybody wants to go in that particular direction, I think we've touched on it, but maybe anybody wants to be more explicit, we were asked to kind of go in that direction. And Rory's been really quiet today, so she must be exhausted from driving back and forth. If I had to hang out with Daniel 5 times in the last couple of I would be energized.
Fair enough. No, I am quite exhausted, and I apologize. I'm seeing the comments, and I'm seeing people asking about Ukraine, and I don't have a lot of, I don't know that I have any wisdom on it. And I also want to be really careful, because I think that a lot of people have been sharing their takes on it, and I'm not an expert in this, right? I want to be very careful about staying in my lane in terms of what I can comment on. I actually think that this conversation that we're having is like, that's the conversation that I can wrestle with, right? Because whatever we would even decide, right? Even if we would decide that we should focus all of our energy exclusively on the Ukrainian Jewish community, I'm still not the person who knows how to save the Ukrainian Jewish community. And even if I'm the person, even if we all decided that we shouldn't focus on the Jewish community, whatever the conclusion is, I mean, I think like there are experts who are involved in this, and that we need to turn to them in terms of really understanding all the geopolitics. And I want to be really careful that like we all understand what role we're able to play. And I want to, I'm going to get on my soapbox for a minute, maybe because of last night a little bit, right? But I want to say like, what has pained me so much, I know I'm going a bit off topic, but I really am getting to a point, I promise, maybe. What really, and I've talked to Daniel, like we've talked about this a bit, is that like, we're advocating on these bills because we know the people who are impacted by these bills. We hear from them, we're talking to them, and so we want to help elevate their voices. And then there's people who come and testify because someone told them it would be a good idea. Like, they have not done their research. They've never talked to any of the people, right? And it's like, that's part of what makes me so angry, is that for some, I don't know any of these people. Many of them, I would assume, are not actually trying to be malicious. They think that what they're doing is noble. And if they would really stop, I mean, the hearing went so late last night, and the people who testified in favor all left after like the first 2 people testified opposed.
Hold on. The 2 people who testified in favor left, and the 50 people who schlepped hours and hours across the state were there. Yeah.
Right. And I was upset that they left, because they needed to hear those stories. Like, they needed to hear from the kids that were going to be impacted by this bill that they traveled to advocate for. But I say that to say, like, I think it's really dangerous. Like, I think that it's dangerous when we all, like, it's fine to have opinions. We all have opinions. But when we have opinions about things that we don't know anything about, and we then advocate on it, I think it becomes really dangerous. So I want to be really careful that I'm not speaking about what's happening in Ukraine, because I don't know how to best help the people. I don't know if it's better for people to leave. I don't know if it's better for people to try to rebuild. Like, I don't know the answers to those questions. And I'm happy to help think about like, who are the resources and the things like that. Some people are typing in, right? So you do have groups like HIAS that are deeply involved with refugee resettlement. I know there are refugees that will be coming to St. Louis through the International Institute. There's a lot of conversation about Ukrainian. There's still other global refugees that are also in need of help. I mean, we can kind of keep going with all of it. To me, the question that I think we can really guide on, that I want to really bring us back to, is I think it's the question here. Like, I think also what the Ukraine question brings up for all of us is like, who do we want to be, right? Like, I can't answer what everybody else should do, but I think that what we all can grapple with is, who do we want to be? I mean, and frankly, like, that was part of what I said last night in Missouri. I was like, these bills are about who we are as a state, right? Like, what we choose to do is about who we are as a community, who we are as congregations.
Rory, sorry to interrupt. I just want to add, and also, at least for me, who I don't want to be.
Yeah.
I don't want to be that guy who doesn't say anything. And as much as I appreciate so much your humility and your modesty, which really, really moves me as you're speaking, I also know that if I sit here and do nothing, and you're not a sitter and doing nothing, or your whole life is doing, and you do it with humility. And I just want to say that we can get frozen into inaction by an over humility And so I hope that you won't allow this to kind of, you can't shrink from it. You know you can't, and you're not shrinking from it. You're just doing it in a really human, kind, generous way by being humble. But I also think you're not shrinking from it. And I don't want to suggest, and because somebody just asked me the question, why are you guys hiding from this? We're not hiding from the issue. We're simply saying we're not experts in this particular area. Our hearts are breaking over all of these issues, and we're doing the best that we possibly can in the ways in which we can.
So I want to really like push back, because like, yes, and right, but because I can actually stand for some people to shrink from issues that they shouldn't, I also think we live in a time right now where like people think that they need to comment on everything, and frankly, like not every comment is actually helpful, right? And so I want to say, like, I think that we all owe it to ourselves, to each other, to not only insist for ourselves, but insist for our leadership that what they comment on is useful and valuable and appropriate. And what I mean by that is, right, because I feel like everyone wants to see someone saying something. So then, we all can, like, I don't know, we can change it. I can make my background blue and yellow, and that doesn't actually do anything, right? That's performative. And performative, like sometimes sometimes that's important because big shows of support can mean something. And sometimes performative is just like staying on your couch and thinking, I pat myself on the back, I did really good work, and now I'm done. So I want to be careful in terms of performative, but I want to actually, like, let me use this other example because it's what I know better. But again, I'm bringing us to the point on Ukraine also. I'm on this Orthodox rabbinic listserv of rabbis who like want to be deeply involved in social justice work. And after the Texas governor put out the call saying that that parents can be investigated for giving gender affirming care to their kids, somebody emailed the listserv and said, should we say something about this? And a few of the rabbis responded and they said, I don't know, this is really complicated. I don't know, gender affirming care is like a really, how young should the kids be? Like, they were like really wrestling with, genuine, like from their heart, right? They like were really wrestling with it. And I wrote back and I said, no one's asking you to do the surgery. Like, no one's asking, like, what are you actually being, so they were like wrestling with like, should these kids get this surgery or not? And I said, like, that's actually not your business. Like, no one's asking you to perform the surgery. Your rabbis, like, your role is to say, you are loved. You are loved and your community welcomes you and you will be welcome here at all times. Like, and I really kind of trying to push them to say, and so, yeah, like, I don't know how Naftali Bennett is involved in negotiations with Ukraine and Biden is withdrawing oil, and like, that's not, like, there are experts on all that stuff, right? Like, so I don't want us to be silent. I don't want us to be silent, but I think it's also dangerous when people like me start to say, like, end oil dependence. Like, I don't know anything about oil. I don't.
Rory,
it's not my lane.
Rory, can I want to add a really quick thought that is tangential, but directly tangential, and also to apologize because I have another obligation. I'm going to have to leave early and join. But what you just said is,
it has to do with oil, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I'm going to meet with the energy department. No, but what you just said is so important. I think this is less about the words we write or read or say or the symbolic actions or rituals we perform, and it's about our being. And I can't help but think about that beautiful teaching of Hillel in the Talmud. When he says, in a place where there is no humanity, that's where we have to lihiot. He says lihiotish, right? And he's not talking about gender there when he says be a man. He's saying be humane in a place where there is an absence of humanity. And I want to just say, we are living in a time when, for all sorts of reasons, there is an absence of humanity. There's an absence of humanity when it comes to the way politicians are using gender as a divisive wedge to gain their own power and control, or women's reproductive rights, or race, or we can go on and on and on. And whatever Putin is insanely trying to accomplish by attacking Ukraine, in places, and this is why I think this question of universalism and particularism is so critically important to us as Jews. In a world where there seems all the time to be an absence of humanity, that's where we as Jews are called just to be humane. And it is not about, it's not ultimately about us. It's ultimately about all of us. The climate crisis is another great example. There's so much reverting to selfish, parochial, tribal, nationalistic needs. And I think our call as Jews is to be different, to be Roma. And if we are exceptional, if we are chosen, it is that we are chosen to remind everybody that none of us are chosen, that we are all human, that we're all in this together. So I don't know what that even means as far as the way Jewish synagogues should look, or how our prayer books should be structured, or how our theology should be. To me, those are red herrings.
By the way, I'm back to wanting to say Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, based on what you just said.
Okay, you're right.
And to say to myself, I'm not praying outwards. I'm praying to myself to say, God chose me to do whatever little I can do with humility, knowing that I don't know, as Rory said, about the oil crisis. I care about certain things, but I don't know enough about them to speak logically about. But what I do care about, and I think you said this so beautifully, I care about menschlichkeit.
Right.
I care about the notion of loving people, right? I care about the notion of creating an environment where people who don't agree with one another can still talk to one another, still face one another, can still debate with one another, can still honor one another, can walk away out of a session where there's deep, deep disagreement and still say, I care really deeply about you. And if you had a success, I would send you a note wishing you a mazel tov. And if you had a loss or a tragedy, I'd be there to hold your hand and put my arm around you and tell you, I love you and I care about you. That kind of work goes a long way, and you don't need to be an expert in it.
Amen. Amen.
I want to tell you that one of the saddest moments in my life was I had a friend who unfortunately committed suicide, and I knew that she was in a bad way. And she called me, and it was before the days of everybody having a cell phone. And I knew she wasn't in a good way. And I just refrained from participating in that moment in time when I probably should have run to the hotel that she was in, which ultimately she jumped off the roof of that hotel. And I didn't go, right? And I was so embarrassed to go to the funeral that I stood literally outside of the cemetery and watched the funeral from afar. And the mourners, the parents, called me and said to me, you should have come in. You should have come in. You should have stood with us. You were mourning as well. That act of kindness reminded me that goes so far. I mean, it's not, they didn't absolve me of my guilt of having not been present, but they said to me, I'm with Anochi imo b'tzara. I'm with you in the midst of this terrible tragedy. And that in and of itself reinforces for me the work that we do. I believe in this. People say to me all the time, why are we just praying why are we just praying? Why are we not doing anything? Right now, what I can bring to the table is powerful prayer. What I can bring to people is powerful focus and concentration, and hope that people will go inward to try to find the best versions of themselves, to bring that to the table, to make the world a little bit better, whether it's through helping Jews in Ukraine, or whether it's helping Ukrainians, or whether it's helping wherever, right? At least something that'll be incrementally better, because doing nothing gets us nowhere, right? And pretending like I know all the solutions gets us nowhere, right? So I could become frozen. And the notion of Bachar is this, right? God's put God's finger on you. You, human, do this. You can't just sit there and do nothing. And to me, that's really what I think this, at least for me, this is what this moment is about, and why this notion of Bachar Banu, right, gets us into the conversation. This liturgical reality. Do I want to say what I mean what I say? Is that always necessary? Is it sometimes necessary? Is now more than ever important? And I think those are the kinds of things that we can deal with in our religious, spiritual environments.
I just need to shine a light on what I just heard you say, Carney, of I think was a radical reinterpretation of Bachar, of to say that chosenness as God saying I created you in this unique way, and you have a unique role to play in this world, right? And you were chosen for this, which I love so deeply. It also, we're coming up on Purim, and I think, right, that's the sort of Oh, I don't have words. I'm too tired, right? Like the, high point of the Megillah, right? Like
Im le'ed kazot higat lemalchut, right? It's
thank you. I knew you'd
you're
help
right.
me out, right? But
Right.
right, and it's what Mordecai says to Esther, right? Like this is the moment you were built for, right? Like this is it. And and I think about that because I think like so like I want to take I think you're taking what I'm saying, but you're giving it the positive spin, right? Because I want to sort of say both, right? Like there's times where I think we feel pulled into a situation that actually is not our situation, right? Like God forbid if you're on an airplane and someone has a medical emergency and they say like, can anyone help? Like I have to stay in my seat because I would just get in the way. I'm not I don't know what to, right? Now, could I comfort the rest of the family, right? Can I, but like, when there's a plane and lots of things are happening, like better for me to be out of the way, right? Like, we all sort of want to jump up and help. And sometimes that's the worst thing to do. But then the other side of it is then to say, okay, look, it's not to then take that to say, here's my excuse to stay on my couch all day. It's saying, okay, I'm not called when there's an emergency on the plane, that's not what I'm called for. But there's other moments, right? There's other incredibly holy moments that I know every one of us here on this screen like has been called into, right? Like the moments where suddenly we realize like we were here for a reason and that we can do something that other people are not able to do, that we can guide a family, that we can make this holy space. And I think I don't know. I'm seeing sort of on the chat, like, I don't know everybody who's on here, but I think like the idea that we all have that, right? And I think like that's part of the challenge for us is sort of finding those paths for each of us. So it's saying like, don't get caught up, right? Because I do think it's dangerous when people start to try to make us caught up in what we shouldn't be caught up in. But also, right, it's which are the moments where we have to look at ourselves and say, right? Like this is, you were put here for exactly this reason. And we need you right now for this. And sometimes those aren't the obvious things, right? Like sometimes it's it's something none of us ever thought we'd be capable of doing, and but somehow we are. And I love that framing of chosenness, of saying like we have limitations. I can't do everything, but there's some things that I need to do and that I'm called to do in this world.
And sometimes they're beyond what we imagine our reach can be, and only being tried in the crucible of being forced into it. So, for example, Roy, I don't know how you would feel, but if there wasn't a doctor and I didn't know what to do, what would I try to do? Would I try to use the little medical knowledge that I have to help? Would that be working against? I'm not sure. And I would think that trying to do something as a good Samaritan, that kind of concept, to me feels like, how could I not? Right? Because of what Rabbi Bennett said earlier, in the absence of humanity, be human. So if I couldn't, I don't know, do CPR, could I go over and at least hold their hand, stroke their forehead, tell them that I'm praying for them or with them? Or what could I do? I don't really know. But I do know that I would feel compelled. And I think that's the Bachar Banu. And maybe God would give me some dumb luck and I would help in some kind of way. But I know that absenting myself doesn't help. I mean, there are moments, obviously, to hold back. Where there's 3 doctors going, right? I'm not going to jump forward and say, I know what I'm doing. But if nobody stands up and nothing happens, how would I feel in that moment in time? It's a funny story. In our shul, we had a psychiatrist who passed out, and somebody else, is there a doctor in the house? It's B'nai Emunah. So somebody else yells, is anybody here not a doctor? Right? And so 12 different specialties run over to him and 1 insurance salesman. Right. And the guy wakes up from whatever he was having, and he says, what are you doing? You're going to sell me insurance now? He said, well, you probably should have had it before. Right. And so on some level, it added a little humor to it, but at least he tried. Right. The fact is that he tried, not in an intrusive way. And the question is there some way that we can insert ourselves in a non-arrogant, aggressive way, but rather in a loving, gentle way, and bringing the best of the skills and talents that we do have to these moments in time. And I think that's going to be the great challenge for us going forward. All ideologies aside, all passions aside, right? God forbid somebody who was in opposition to your position at Jeff City had an issue. You would still be a Maharat. You would still be a rabbi. You'd still be a compassionate human in their direction. And you do so with great Jewish intentionality, because of the teachings that come from our tradition, which are not necessarily always unique to our tradition, but in many cases are. And if they're not unique to our tradition, in many cases, we brought those to the world. And then we still should own that. And for me, that feels like a reinterpretation that's helpful for me with Asher Bachar Banu. So I'm not giving it up. I just wanted to mention one of the brachot that we didn't, or the iterations of the brachot is Asher Bachar Banu im kol ha'amim. You've chosen us with all the other nations of the world. In other words, it's additive. So yes, you chose us and you chose them. And if we all just lived out our role, what a wonderful world it would be.
I'm struck by the way that this conversation seems to be, throughout this last hour, revolving around these poles of humility and chauvinism. Interestingly, like spells a lot like chosen, chauvinism there. Both in terms of how we reflect internally about staying in our lane, not staying in our lane, action externally, but also I think how it speaks to our notions of chosenness, right? Like, I love that, I'm going to butcher his name because I don't listen to cable news. Zelensky, how do you say his name? Zelensky? Right? Like, I love that he's Jewish. I love it. I love it.
Just call him Superman.
Right? Yeah. But the other time when I really feel that, Rory, I bet you feel this too, is when you show up at events that are about protecting trans kids. Let me tell you that, like, the Jews are the leadership, and the Jews are the ones who organized, and the Jews are the ones who called the pastors and asked the pastors to be there, and the pastors looked to the Jews for how to testify and what to do. And it's inspiring to see that we are this tiny little minority, and right, like that's when I feel Aleinu. That's when I feel like, yes, everyone should be a part of this.
See, that's when I feel Bachar Banu.
That's what I mean by Aleinu. Yeah.
I mean, right? I don't see a universalistic there. I see very particularistic, that you are there doing that work. It doesn't surprise me that in many of the causes that I care most deeply about, I encounter people who are not outwardly engaged and involved in Jewish life, but are Jewish. And will often say to me, I don't know exactly why I have this feeling. And often I'll say to them, I know exactly why. I know exactly why, because this comes in your DNA. Right. And I hate to sound that way because it makes us sound a little bit, talk about chauvinistic, right? I don't want to say it's a racial thing, it's a DNA thing. Somehow or other, we've been trained and taught to be these kinds of people. Look, whenever I go to spiritual communities and I encounter all these people, right? How many people have strange names like Vivekananda, whatever it is, whatever. And it turns out, what was your name growing up? Sheldon Schwartz, right? And how did Sheldon Schwartz become sitting at the side of the guru? Right? All the people in Fairfield, right, who are all part of the Maharishi's community, right? Like, these are all Jews. These are all Jews. Why? Because on some level, they've been drawn to the numinous. They've been drawn to the spiritual. And somehow or another, we've been trained that way. I would just like to be able to say that a lot of this drawing comes from the tradition from which we come, which allows us to also feel drawn in some kind of way with the finger, chosen to bring spirituality. And I don't get angry at them for doing the spiritual work that they're doing. I said, Baruch Hashem, God chose them to do that spiritual work, and they're helping people in their way.
I think what it keeps coming down to for me is, like, how do we do it without becoming complacent? Like, that's the danger of chosenness for me, right? And that's, I think, like where I started us off, for me, like where my first comment, right, was when chosenness is sort of like tied to this like victimhood, and it's a sort of idea of like, we are always going to be persecuted, and we're always going to be this minority, and it has to only be about protecting ourselves, and it's the turning inward, and it's all of those pieces, right? And there's like a certain complacency that I feel at times of like, I don't have to do anything because I'm chosen, as opposed to, I think what we've all said of like chosenness is like a responsibility, right? And not chosenness again as a exclusive chosenness, right? But as in the way that like every one of us has our role to play in the world. And I'm just thinking about, and I'm not going to quote it properly, but there's this beautiful midrash, and I sometimes pair it with the story of Esther, because I think it's such a beautiful kind of balance of like, how we think about it. But there's this beautiful midrash of God calling to Moshe, and and sort of like, that when God first speaks to Moses, that like he doesn't really step forward, and God has to keep saying, step forward, like step forward. And each time God has to kind of call Moshe again, and first at the bush, and then later for Paro, and all of the places. And finally God says to Moses, he goes, why do I have to keep telling you this? Like, if you don't do this, nobody else in the world is going to do it. Right? Which I actually think is sometimes the contrast, right? Because what Mordecai says to Esther is, look, if you don't do this, someone else is going to come along, and you're just going to be lost. But I think, I really genuinely think, I mean, I know we're at the end of our time. Like, for me, like these are sort of the two poles that I think we constantly hold, right? There's sometimes where it doesn't have to be me, right? And maybe that's like the doctor on the airplane if there's 12 other doctors, right? Like, where there's other times where somebody else can step forward and do this, and maybe it should be me because I can help, and maybe it shouldn't be me. But then there's also those moments where if you don't do it, the world is just going to lose this forever, right? If you don't bring it into the world, then the world will never have it. And I think we all have to go through the world kind of carrying that, to say, like, we're all here for a reason. There's something that we can contribute. And what are the things that if we stay home today, never will be realized in the world, right? And that we've cheated the world. And so chosenness should never be like a great, I can stay on the couch and wear my mantle and my crown, and and that chosenness is not something that we just kind of feel pride in. But I think it's something we feel pride in because we take it as a call to action, right? And I feel so proud. I love seeing Jews leading on all of these things, right? Because I love being part of that, and I love seeing all of that. And I think it's a call for all of us. The hardest part is figuring out which is our call to action, right? What are the pieces that we're called to do?
You know what I wish
think
I could do, or we could do? I wonder if we could find, when we see people and they come to our communities, our shuls, our events, our whatever protests, whatever, that we could say, oh, I'm so happy you're here. And like, I could name what they bring, the gift that they bring. Like I talked about it before in terms of what finishing shul, and sort of here's what I've taken away from this experience today and what I'm going to do in the world. What about when somebody arrives in this space? I'm so here because you've brought with you, right, this gift. And if we could acknowledge it, the only time I really felt that way in my whole life really was with Rabbi Shlomo Karlebach. Rabbi Shlomo made me feel like I was the center of the universe arriving. Like my arrival made the event happen, or his life happen in that moment. How about we could have that intensity of kind of people, with all the limitations of who those characters are, just feeling that way. People really see you for the gifts that you bring. And I hope that all of us feel that way. In fact, I hope that the two of you in particular, during the time that you were in Jeff City, felt like you were, you were like shlichim, you were emissaries carrying a really heavy burden, and that many of us who couldn't be there with you were lined up behind you. And we see that you were chosen to do this work, and I hope that you feel that way, each of us. This notion of calling is a hard one for us as Jews. We don't like to use that language, but I wish we could more often, and I think we could teach it to people that I'm called to do the following. So, and we're called to finish the session, I think.
I know. Let's Daniel, why don't you close this out with the last word?
This was interesting. There's going to be a lot to think about. I'm struck that we did not touch on what in many ways was the original idea, which was the intersection between chosenness and nationalism, and the existence of a Jewish state, right? So maybe I'll end with teaching from one of our teachers, Micha Goodman. So Elena, we've framed it a few different ways. So I'm ending, so I'm going to get to choose the framing here. I see Elena.
You are chosen,
Yeah, there you go. I see Elena as a deeply chauvinistic text, right? It's certainly an image dreaming that everyone will see themselves as one, but it's an image that everyone sees themselves as one because they agree that we were right and they bow down to that. And Micha Goodman talks about how the difference between Israeli Jews and American Jews is American Jews need a little more Aleinu and Israeli Jews need a little less. So maybe I will end there.
I have to say you're right. Yeshar koach. Thank you, everybody. What a great session.
Sorry
to be continued.
Always to be continued.
To be continued. Thank you all. Thanks, Autumn, for the help today.